It's not just another battle, it's a game changer. Imagine you're a German tank commander, deeply entrenched in one of the fiercest battles of World War II. Everything you've learned, everything you've been trained for, comes down to this. The tanks are moving in formation, but something feels off. The Americans, who you thought you knew how to defeat, seem to be one step ahead. How are they coordinating their movements? How do they know where every tank is, even without direct sight? How do they do it? That's exactly what German commanders were asking when they first encountered the power of American radio technology during the Battle of North Africa. It wasn't the armor or the firepower of the Sherman tanks that shocked them. It was the invisible force behind their success. The radios. Yes, you heard it right. The radios. In a world where communication on the battlefield could make the difference between life and death, the United States had perfected a technology that Germany couldn't even comprehend. They thought they had the best systems until they realized they didn't even have a chance. Before we dive deep into this, imagine this. During the war, German forces relied on radio systems that, by today's standards, would be considered obsolete, a relic of the past. But the Americans, with their SCR-508 radio, had set a new standard. Let me take you back to 1943, to the middle of the desert in Tunisia. You've got a German tank battalion, and you're expecting the usual challenge, a well-coordinated enemy in the field. But instead, something extraordinary happens. American Sherman tanks, operating far beyond your line of sight, are moving with an uncanny precision, almost like they can communicate without speaking. They're cutting through the battlefield, shifting and maneuvering together, responding to threats, coordinating attacks without a word exchanged between them. The Germans were left in the dust trying to figure out how it all worked. This moment changed everything. The German panzer divisions, famed for their ability to adapt quickly to battlefield situations, were suddenly left scrambling, unable to adapt to a new reality where their own radio systems, their most trusted tool, were completely outclassed by American technology. German radios, which could only transmit in static-filled bursts, paled in comparison to the crystal-clear frequency modulation of the American radios. The Germans had been depending on systems that simply couldn't keep up. So what was the secret behind the American success? It wasn't just about having the better tanks. It was the radios that made all the difference. These radios didn't just transmit signals. They created a system of communication that allowed American tank crews to work together as a single unit. Even when separated by miles of rough terrain, they could coordinate, communicate, and respond to the battlefield as a team in real time. Meanwhile, German tanks were stuck relying on outdated systems that couldn't even allow them to respond or report enemy movements. The Germans couldn't even imagine what was happening on the other side of the battlefield. Now, before I go further into the story, I want to ask you, if you're fascinated by the true technological battles of World War II, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You'll get more of these incredible untold stories right here. And while you're at it, give this video a thumbs up. It helps bring more awesome history to the forefront. We've only scratched the surface, so stick around as we continue to uncover how the Americans used technology to outmatch the Germans. Let's dig deeper into the world of military radios. The SCR-508, the radio that changed the course of history, was more than just a piece of equipment. It was the foundation of a battlefield network that allowed American forces to act as a collective intelligence. Each tank was connected to the others, creating a seamless network of communication that gave them a significant edge. Think about it. Every single Sherman tank in the American fleet was part of this system, from the smallest command tank to the largest armored unit. Now let's take a closer look at the German side of things. The panzer divisions were formidable, no doubt, but their radios, the FUG-5 transceivers, were quickly becoming outdated. These radios had a range of just a few miles under ideal conditions and struggled to function properly as the battle progressed. In contrast, the American SCR-508s were crystal-controlled, meaning they could maintain clear communication without interference from engine noise, explosions, or the chaos of the battlefield. The Germans couldn't even dream of something like that. As a result, their tanks were often isolated, unable to coordinate with each other in real time, and this was a critical weakness that the Americans exploited to devastating effect. So, how did the Americans achieve such technological superiority? It wasn't just by chance. It was the result of years of research and development. Engineers at Galvin Manufacturing, later known as Motorola, worked tirelessly to create the perfect military radio system. The SCR-508 was the result of their efforts. A radio that could withstand the harsh environment of a battlefield, could be heard above the roar of tank engines, and could transmit and receive with clarity even under the most difficult conditions. The SCR-508, with its 25-watt power and FM transmission, could maintain communication over much greater distances and with far more clarity than the German FUG-5, which used AM transmission and often struggled with static and interference. This gave American forces the ability to communicate effectively and efficiently on the battlefield, something the Germans simply couldn't match. And this technological advantage wasn't just for a few lucky American tanks, it was standard issue for every Sherman tank. The result? A fleet of tanks that could act as a unified force, responding to threats and opportunities faster than the Germans could even process what was happening. But what does this all mean for the battle? Well, as the war progressed, the American tanks were no longer fighting as individual units. They were part of a larger, interconnected network. The Sherman tanks were able to coordinate and react to threats in real time, and this ability was the key to their success. For the Germans, this meant that their once elite armored divisions were now fighting blind. They couldn't communicate effectively, and as a result, their ability to coordinate their attacks or respond to American movements was severely hindered. The battle was no longer just about tanks or guns. It was about communication, and the Americans had it in spades. Now let's talk about the impact this had on the battlefield. In February 1943, during the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, the Americans showed just how powerful their radio systems were. Even though the Germans won the battle tactically, the American ability to maintain communication across a vast battlefield was mind-blowing. American tank crews, many of whom had never met before, coordinated their attacks and responded to threats as if they were all in the same unit. German intelligence officers couldn't believe it. They intercepted American communications and were stunned by the clarity and precision of the transmissions. The Americans were moving as a single unit, even though they were scattered across miles of terrain, and the Germans were left scrambling to understand how this was happening. In the coming months, the American advantage in radio communication would only grow. The use of FM technology would continue to prove invaluable as the Americans advanced across Italy and eventually into France. The Germans, despite their superior tanks, couldn't compete with the American ability to coordinate and communicate on the battlefield. The Americans were creating a new type of warfare, one where communication wasn't just a secondary factor, it was the key to success. As we move forward in this story, keep in mind just how important this technology was. The American tanks weren't just rolling off the assembly line with better armor or bigger guns. They were rolling off with a secret weapon, the ability to communicate with one another instantly, across any distance in any terrain. The Germans, on the other hand, had to rely on outdated systems that couldn't even keep their own tanks in contact, let alone coordinate attacks. The gap between these two forces was more than just a difference in technology. It was a difference in how warfare was fought. The Americans had revolutionized the battlefield, and the Germans were still fighting a war with a communication system that was already obsolete. And this brings us to the key lesson in this story. Communication is the ultimate force multiplier. It doesn't matter how many tanks you have or how big your guns are if you can't coordinate your efforts. The Americans understood this and they used it to devastating effect. They didn't just win battles, they created a system that allowed them to control the battlefield in a way that the Germans could never hope to match. Before I dive into how this all played out in the later stages of the war, don't forget to like this video if you're enjoying this deep dive into military history, and make sure to subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one. There's so much more to explore and we're just getting started. Now let's see how this technological advantage played out in the larger scope of the war, and how it shaped the fate of the Sherman tanks and the entire Allied effort in the fight against the Germans. Now let's fast forward to the heart of the action, the battlefield. As American tanks continued to roll across Europe, their radio technology didn't just provide an edge, it became the cornerstone of their success. Picture this, a battlefield filled with chaos. Explosions shaking the ground beneath your feet, smoke clouding your vision, and the deafening roar of artillery all around. In the middle of this madness, the American tanks are still communicating with precision, moving with a level of coordination that seems almost supernatural. They're not just fighting as individuals, they're part of something much bigger. A network, a system that is constantly adjusting, reacting, and responding to the ever-changing landscape of war. On the other hand, the Germans, despite their reputation for military ingenuity, were struggling. As the battle raged on, their tanks were left isolated, unable to effectively coordinate their movements. Picture a German tank commander, desperately trying to make sense of the battlefield, unable to communicate with his fellow units. His only hope is to rely on visual signals or crude, static-filled radio transmissions. The Germans couldn't even begin to fathom the extent of the technological gap between them and the Americans. They didn't understand that every Sherman tank, no matter how far apart, was linked into a vast, interconnected communication network. Every move, every strategy, every response was coordinated seamlessly, without the need for constant visual contact. This is where the difference between the two armies became glaringly apparent. The Sherman tanks, equipped with their SCR-508 radios, were no longer just machines. They were nodes in an intricate battlefield network. The radios allowed them to communicate instantly, providing critical, real-time information about enemy positions, incoming threats, and battlefield conditions. This system allowed American forces to adapt and respond faster than their German counterparts, who were still struggling with antiquated technology. The radios were the silent force that held the American tank divisions together, transforming them into a cohesive and powerful fighting force that could act with speed and precision, no matter the circumstances. But let's pause for a moment and think about this. What would have happened if the American tanks had been equipped with the same radios as the Germans? The sheer power of communication would have been diminished, and the battle for supremacy on the battlefield would have been drastically different. It's easy to overlook, but this one technological advantage, this invisible, almost magical force of communication, was the reason the American forces were able to maintain control, adapt quickly, and overpower the Germans at every turn. Let's take a look at one particular battle, the Battle of the Bulge, which took place in December 1944. This was a major offensive by the Germans, aimed at splitting the Allied forces and capturing the vital port of Antwerp. The Germans launched their attack with the hope of catching the Americans off guard, but what they didn't count on was the power of American communications. As the Germans advanced, American tank units, despite being outnumbered and facing difficult terrain, were able to coordinate their movements with military precision. Every tank equipped with the SCR-508 was in constant communication with the others, passing along vital information and coordinating their movements. German forces, on the other hand, were still reliant on their outdated radio systems. The Germans were operating in small, isolated units, each struggling to maintain communication under intense fire. Their radios, plagued by static and interference, were unable to provide the clarity and range needed to coordinate their efforts effectively. As a result, the German advance quickly faltered. They could no longer communicate effectively between units, and as a result, their attack lost momentum. The Americans, using their superior communication systems, were able to regroup, counterattack, and eventually turn the tide of the battle. The difference in communication capabilities wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was a game changer. It was the foundation upon which the Allied victory was built. The Germans, despite having superior tanks and weapons, simply couldn't keep up with the speed and precision of American coordination. The battle became a clear example of how superior communication technology could overcome superior firepower. Now, let's dive into how the Americans utilized their communication systems on a larger scale. By mid-1944, the Allies had begun to implement a strategy known as network-centric warfare, where every unit, every soldier, and every piece of equipment was connected into a single, cohesive system. This meant that the battlefields were no longer isolated theaters of combat. Instead, they were interconnected spaces where every move was coordinated, every strategy was communicated, and every unit could respond to changes in real time. The Sherman tanks, with their advanced radios, were a key part of this system. The ability to coordinate such complex operations was crucial, especially as the Americans pushed further into Europe. In Normandy, as the Allies launched Operation Overlord on June 6, 1944, the Sherman tanks played a crucial role. The SCR-508 radios allowed American forces to maintain communication with naval fire support, artillery units, and infantry, all while maneuvering through the dense hedgerows and rugged terrain. The German forces, still reliant on outdated radio systems, simply couldn't compete with the level of coordination the Americans were able to achieve. However, even the American system wasn't without its flaws. One of the challenges faced by the American forces was the incompatibility between tank radios and infantry radios. The infantry used different frequencies, which made it difficult for tanks to communicate directly with infantry units. But the Americans were quick to adapt. They mounted field telephones on their tanks and connected them to the internal communication systems, allowing for a more integrated approach to tank-infantry coordination. This quick thinking and adaptability were key to maintaining the advantage on the battlefield. As the war progressed, American forces continued to push forward, and the technological gap between the Americans and the Germans became even more evident. The Americans were no longer just fighting with better tanks. They were fighting with a fully integrated system that allowed them to act as a unified force. This system of communication allowed them to maintain control, adapt quickly to changing circumstances, and outmaneuver their German counterparts at every turn. Meanwhile, the Germans were still struggling with their outdated systems. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't keep up with the speed and precision of the American forces. They were operating in a world where communication was a luxury, while the Americans had transformed it into a strategic advantage. The Germans, despite their best efforts, simply couldn't match the Americans' ability to coordinate and communicate on the battlefield. The impact of this technological gap wasn't just seen in small skirmishes. It was felt in the larger battles of the war. The ability to coordinate massive armored offensives, maintain communication across vast distances, and respond to changing battlefield conditions gave the Americans a decisive advantage. And as the war went on, this advantage only grew stronger. As we move toward the climax of the war, the impact of American radio technology becomes even more profound. The Germans, realizing the full extent of the technological gap, began to panic. They couldn't keep up with the Americans on the battlefield, and they knew it. Their once dominant tank divisions were now struggling to maintain coordination, and their communication systems were failing them at every turn. But for the Americans, it was a different story. Their radios were more than just a tool. They were a force multiplier, enabling them to maintain battlefield dominance. The Sherman tanks, with their advanced communication systems, became the backbone of the American effort. They weren't just tanks. They were part of a larger interconnected system that was changing the face of warfare. And this, my friends, is where the real lesson of this story lies. The ability to communicate, whether through radios, signals, or any other means, isn't just a technical advantage. It's the key to success in modern warfare. The Sherman tanks didn't just win battles because they had better armor or more firepower. They won because they were part of a system that allowed them to communicate, adapt, and respond to threats faster than the enemy. The Germans, despite their technological superiority in other areas, couldn't keep up because they were fighting without the same level of coordination. The lesson is simple. In war, communication isn't just important, it's everything. The final stages of the war saw American communication technology playing a critical role in shaping the battlefield dynamics. As the Allies advanced deeper into Germany, they encountered fierce resistance from German forces who were trying desperately to hold on. However, despite their best efforts, the Germans were unable to keep pace with the Americans, and their communication system became one of the most significant factors in their downfall. One of the most striking examples of this came during the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans launched a surprise offensive in December 1944, hoping to push back the Allied forces and split their lines. It was a bold move, but one that ultimately failed because of the overwhelming communication superiority of the American forces. German commanders had failed to recognize the impact of American communication networks, which allowed the Allies to react to the German offensive quickly and decisively. While the Germans were relying on outdated radios with limited range and reliability, the Americans were able to use their SCR-508 radios to coordinate effectively across the battlefield. The German forces were scattered, with tanks and infantry unable to communicate effectively with each other. Their units were isolated, and the lack of effective coordination allowed the Americans to strike back quickly, crushing the German offensive. What's truly remarkable about this is the speed with which the Americans were able to respond. German intelligence reports from the battle noted how American units seemed to have an almost supernatural awareness of the situation, with tanks and infantry coordinating movements that the Germans could never have imagined. This coordination wasn't based on luck or better tactics. It was based on the power of their radio systems. The battle highlighted the stark contrast between American and German communication capabilities. Where the Germans struggled to maintain basic communication, the Americans were able to coordinate complex operations with ease. The SCR-508 radios allowed every Sherman tank to function as part of a cohesive unit, able to respond to threats and opportunities in real time. It was a level of integration and coordination that the Germans simply could not match. But it wasn't just the Battle of the Bulge that demonstrated the power of American communications. As the war moved toward its final phases, the Germans were finding themselves increasingly isolated, unable to coordinate effectively with their own forces. By March 1945, the Allies were closing in on Germany from all sides, and the Germans were unable to mount an effective defense. Their communication systems had broken down to such an extent that they couldn't even respond to threats from their own forces, let alone coordinate a counterattack. This breakdown in communication was most evident in the final weeks of the war, when American forces were closing in on the Rhine River. The Germans had been pushed to the brink, and they were now scrambling to mount a defense. However, their tanks, despite being heavily armored and armed, were unable to communicate with each other, let alone with their commanders. Their radios, now completely out of date, failed to provide the clarity and range needed to coordinate their defense effectively. The American forces, on the other hand, were using their superior communication networks to their advantage. Every Sherman tank equipped with its SCR-508 radio was in constant contact with other units. This allowed the Americans to launch coordinated attacks, move tanks into position quickly, and respond to German threats almost instantly. The level of communication and coordination that the Americans achieved during this time was nothing short of extraordinary. The result of this technological gap was clear. As the Allies advanced toward the heart of Germany, the Germans were unable to mount any kind of effective resistance. The failure to recognize the importance of communication in modern warfare had sealed their fate. Despite their superior tanks and artillery, the Germans were outmatched by the American ability to communicate and coordinate on the battlefield. Even as German forces were crumbling, they couldn't adapt to the new reality of warfare. They were stuck in a mindset that relied on outdated communication strategies, while the Americans had embraced a new way of fighting that placed a premium on connectivity and coordination. It was this difference that would ultimately lead to the Germans' defeat. In the final months of the war, German forces were not just being outgunned, they were being outcommunicated. The failure to recognize the importance of effective communication in warfare had left the Germans vulnerable. They couldn't respond to threats as quickly, couldn't coordinate their movements effectively, and couldn't adapt to the rapidly changing conditions on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Americans were able to adapt seamlessly. Their radio systems allowed them to maintain control of the battlefield, and their ability to communicate with each other made them far more effective in combat. It wasn't just the tanks that were winning battles, it was the radios that connected them, that allowed them to fight as one cohesive unit, that ultimately gave the Allies the edge. The technological advantage that the Americans had gained in radio communications didn't just affect the battlefield. It also had a profound impact on the overall course of the war. It was a decisive factor in the final stages of the conflict, allowing the Allies to press their advantage and bring the war to a close. The German forces, despite their best efforts, simply couldn't keep up with the speed, precision, and coordination of the American military. This superiority in communication was evident in nearly every major battle from 1944 to 1945. As the Allies advanced into France, the lowlands, and ultimately into Germany itself, the effectiveness of American communications was impossible to ignore. Every American tank, every unit, was part of a larger system that allowed them to coordinate, react, and adjust on the fly. The Germans, meanwhile, were still relying on their outdated methods. trying to coordinate without the benefit of modern communication systems. The final victory of the Allies in Europe wasn't just a matter of superior firepower or better tanks. It was a victory of systems, of connectivity, and of communication. The Americans had proven that in modern warfare, the side with the best communication systems would have the upper hand. The Germans, despite their superior tanks and artillery, simply couldn't match the level of coordination and adaptability that the Americans brought to the battlefield. By the end of the war, the Germans had learned a painful lesson. Communication, not just weaponry, was the key to victory. The SCR-508 radios and the network-centric warfare they enabled were more decisive than any single weapon or tank. It wasn't just about being stronger. It was about being more connected, more coordinated, and more adaptable. And that, more than anything else, would determine the outcome of the war. As the final days of the war unfolded, one thing became unmistakably clear. The communication systems that the Allies had implemented during the conflict would reshape how warfare was conducted from then on. As the Germans continued their retreat, they couldn't escape the reality that the technological edge enjoyed by the Americans in the realm of communication had profoundly shifted the dynamics of the battlefield. What had started as a small, almost unnoticeable advantage had snowballed into a game-changing factor that ultimately determined the outcome of the war. For the Germans, it was a bitter pill to swallow. They had once prided themselves on their superior engineering, their advanced tanks like the Tiger and Panther. Yet despite their technological advancements, they found themselves outpaced by the Americans' mastery of communications technology. Their radios, although advanced for their time, simply couldn't compete with the superior systems the Americans were employing. It was a crippling disadvantage and one that they would never fully overcome. In the final push across Europe, the Americans' ability to coordinate their tanks, artillery, and infantry units in real time was unmatched. While the Germans were still trying to communicate through outdated systems that had been designed in the 1930s, the Americans were using the latest frequency modulation technology, which allowed them to transmit clear, uninterrupted messages over long distances, even amidst the chaos of battle. The difference between these two systems couldn't have been more apparent, especially as the Allies moved into Germany itself. The battle for the Rhine River bridgehead is a perfect example of the critical role that communication played in the final months of the war. The Germans had dug in, hoping to hold their ground against the advancing Allies. But the Americans had a clear advantage. Their communication systems allowed them to coordinate their forces across vast distances, even in difficult terrain. This gave them the ability to react quickly to changing battlefield conditions, to bring in reinforcements when needed, and to strike at German vulnerabilities before the enemy had a chance to react. The German forces, meanwhile, were isolated. Even though they had powerful tanks, they couldn't coordinate their efforts effectively. In the chaos of battle, their radios were simply unable to transmit with the same clarity and reliability as the American systems. Without effective communication, the Germans were left vulnerable, unable to adapt to the rapidly changing situation on the front lines. It wasn't just in the heat of battle where this technological gap became apparent. As the war drew to a close, German commanders began to realize the extent to which their communication failures had doomed their efforts. In the final months, as the Allies closed in from all sides, the Germans were unable to pull together a coherent defense. Their communications were fragmented, their tank units isolated, and their ability to respond to threats was severely limited. Meanwhile, the Americans, equipped with their SCR-508 radios, were able to coordinate their forces across vast distances. They could call for air support, artillery, and reinforcements within minutes, responding to the enemy in real time. This level of coordination made the difference between success and failure in the final stages of the war. While the Germans struggled to maintain any semblance of order, the Americans were moving swiftly, decisively, and cohesively toward victory. The inability to adapt to this new communication-driven style of warfare was perhaps the most significant factor in the German defeat. The Germans had superior tanks and firepower, but without the ability to coordinate their use, they were like a ship without a rudder, adrift in a sea of chaos. The Americans, on the other hand, had perfected the art of networked warfare. Every Sherman tank was part of a larger coordinated system, linked by sophisticated radios that allowed them to operate as a unified force. This wasn't just about having the best tanks. It was about understanding the importance of communication in modern warfare, the ability to move in sync, to support each other, and to respond to threats without hesitation was a game changer. The Germans, despite their technological prowess, had overlooked this crucial element. Their failure to adapt to the new realities of warfare meant they couldn't compete with the Americans, whose technological edge in communications proved to be the deciding factor. As the war drew to a close, the Germans were left with the sobering realization that their tanks, their weaponry, and their tactics had been undermined by their inability to communicate effectively. The SCR-508 radios, though initially seen as a minor innovation, had proven to be the true force multiplier. They allowed the Americans to operate as a network, to share information instantly, and to react faster than the Germans could ever have anticipated. In the final months, this communication superiority was most evident as the Allies began to move towards Berlin. The Germans, isolated and unable to coordinate their forces, were left helpless as the Americans executed flawless operations. Each American tank, each infantry division, each artillery strike was coordinated through a seamless communication network, allowing the Allies to advance with incredible speed and precision. German commanders who had once believed that their tanks and weapons would win the war were now forced to confront the harsh truth. The Americans had won not just with superior firepower, but with superior communication. The technological gap between the two sides had become impossible to bridge, and it was this advantage more than anything else that secured the Allies' victory. The lesson learned by the Germans was stark and profound. In modern warfare, communication was the key to victory. The ability to coordinate, to react in real time, and to share information across the battlefield was the true advantage. Tanks and artillery, no matter how powerful, were only as effective as the communication systems that linked them together. In the years following the war, this lesson would resonate far beyond the battlefield. As military strategy evolved in the post-war years, the importance of communication and coordination became clear. The legacy of the SCR-508 radio and its role in the Allied victory would shape military doctrine for decades to come. The world had changed, and with it, the very nature of warfare. The German defeat in World War II wasn't just the result of superior weaponry or tactics. It was the result of their failure to understand the importance of communication in modern warfare. The Americans had not only built superior tanks and weapons, they had built a networked army, one that could operate as a single cohesive unit, no matter how far apart its forces were. This was the true key to their success. In the end, the SCR-508 radio wasn't just a piece of military equipment. It was the foundation of a new way of fighting, a way that would shape the future of warfare for years to come. The Germans had the weapons, but the Americans had the technology to make those weapons work together. This was the true revolution in military affairs, one that changed the course of history. As the Allied forces moved ever closer to the heart of Germany, it became increasingly clear that the technological edge in communication would be the deciding factor in the final chapters of the war. German tank units, once considered the pinnacle of armored warfare, were now facing a formidable challenge, not from the Americans' weapons, but from their ability to communicate across the battlefield. The Germans, despite their superior firepower and advanced tanks like the Tiger and Panther, were crippled by their outdated communication systems. Their radios simply could not compete with the sophistication of the American frequency modulation systems. In the final battles leading up to the collapse of the German war machine, the importance of effective communication became impossible to ignore. For the Allies, the ability to quickly coordinate large-scale operations, shift forces in real time, and communicate instantaneously across vast distances was invaluable. Every American tank crew, every artillery unit, every infantry soldier was part of a cohesive, interconnected force. This collective intelligence, powered by advanced radio technology, gave the Allies an unprecedented level of battlefield awareness. The Germans, on the other hand, were isolated. Their tanks, though formidable, operated as individual units with limited communication capabilities. This gap in communication technology had profound consequences. One of the most significant battles to highlight the advantages of superior communication was the fight for the Remagen Bridge. When the bridge was captured by the 9th Armored Division, in March 1945, it provided a golden opportunity for the Allies to cross the Rhine River and gain a foothold deep inside Germany. The rapid response and coordination of the American forces, facilitated by their advanced radio networks, allowed them to secure the bridgehead and prevent the Germans from counterattacking. The key to the success of this operation wasn't just the bravery of the soldiers or the firepower of the tanks. It was the ability to communicate and coordinate across a wide front, ensuring that every unit was synchronized. In contrast, the Germans, who were still relying on outdated radios with limited range and clarity, were unable to respond quickly or effectively. Their communication systems were vulnerable to interference, and once the initial wave of American forces crossed the Rhine, the Germans found themselves scrambling to mount a defense. Their tanks and infantry were scattered, unable to communicate effectively, and their command structures were disrupted. The German inability to adapt to the new technological landscape was becoming increasingly apparent. The failure of German communications played a major role in the rapid collapse of their defensive lines. But the story doesn't end with just the failure of German communications. The Allies' success with communication would shape the future of military strategy and warfare. The lessons learned from World War II laid the groundwork for modern, network-centric warfare, where information dominance became the primary force multiplier. The SCR-508 radio, which had been a key enabler of the Allies' battlefield success, would prove to be a model for future military communication systems. The war had shown that it wasn't enough to just have superior weapons. It was the ability to coordinate and share information quickly that made the difference between victory and defeat. As the war entered its final months, the disparity between the American and German communication systems became more pronounced. German commanders, once masters of tank warfare, found themselves unable to communicate with their own units, let alone coordinate with other divisions. Their radio systems were outdated, inefficient, and prone to interference. In contrast, the Americans had perfected the art of battlefield communication. The SCR-508 radio allowed commanders to monitor multiple frequencies simultaneously, ensuring that every tank, every unit, and every soldier was in sync. This technological advantage gave the Allies a strategic edge that the Germans could never overcome. It wasn't just the tanks that benefited from this technological revolution. The entire American military was integrated into a communication network that stretched from the front lines all the way back to command centers. The ability to call for air support, artillery fire, or reinforcements at a moment's notice allowed the Americans to adapt to changing battlefield conditions with unmatched speed. The Germans, on the other hand, were limited by their communication systems. Even their most advanced tanks, like the Tiger, could not function effectively without clear communication with other units. When those communication lines broke down, the tanks were left isolated, unable to coordinate with the rest of the force. This technological gap was made all the more apparent during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The German offensive, which had initially caught the Allies off guard, soon faltered as the German forces struggled to maintain communication. The Americans, despite being initially surprised by the attack, were able to quickly regroup and launch a counteroffensive. The key to their rapid response was their ability to communicate effectively across their entire force. The German forces, in contrast, were hampered by their inability to coordinate their units. Their tanks, though formidable, could not operate effectively without the ability to communicate with other units, and this lack of coordination led to their eventual defeat. The failure of German communications was not just a tactical problem, it was a strategic one. The Germans had failed to recognize the importance of reliable communication in modern warfare, and as a result, they were outmatched by the Americans, whose communication systems gave them a decisive advantage. The Germans were fighting a war where their tanks and weapons could not compensate for their lack of coordination. The Americans, on the other hand, had built an army that could function as a single cohesive unit, connected by advanced communication networks. By the time the Allies reached the heart of Germany in the spring of 1945, The Germans had been pushed to the brink of collapse. Their military was fragmented, their command structure was in disarray, and their ability to respond to the American advance had been crippled by their outdated communication systems. The Americans, with their advanced radios and sophisticated coordination networks, had moved across Europe with an unmatched sense of unity and purpose. The Germans, in contrast, had been fighting a losing battle against time and technology. In the final months of the war, the German military leadership was forced to confront the reality that their technological edge, once considered their greatest strength, had become their greatest weakness. The failure to adapt to the new technological landscape, particularly in the realm of communication, had doomed their efforts. The Americans, with their superior communication systems, had effectively neutralized the German advantage in tanks and artillery. The war, which had once seemed winnable for the Germans, had slipped through their fingers as they failed to recognize the true importance of battlefield communication. As the war came to its final stages, the importance of communication technology could not have been more evident. The American military, armed with their superior communication systems, had created an unstoppable force that the Germans simply couldn't match. The fact that every American tank, every artillery unit, and every soldier could communicate instantly across the battlefield gave them an immense advantage. It wasn't just about the weapons they carried. It was about how they could share information, coordinate their movements, and adapt to the rapidly changing conditions of the battlefield. For the Germans, the war was already lost long before their surrender in May 1945. Their tanks, which were once considered the best in the world, had been neutralized by the American ability to communicate and coordinate. While the Germans fought isolated battles, the Americans were operating as a unified force, sharing intelligence, calling for support, and responding to threats in real time. The speed and flexibility of the American forces were unmatched, and this was all thanks to their ability to communicate across vast distances, even in the most challenging terrain. By 1945, the Allies had established complete dominance in both land and air, but it was their ability to synchronize these forces that gave them the upper hand. The Germans, on the other hand, were still using outdated communication methods that made it impossible to coordinate their various units effectively. This gap in communication technology was the key to the success of the Allies. While the Germans had superior tanks, aircraft, and artillery, they lacked the means to use them in a coordinated, efficient manner. The Americans, however, had perfected the art of battlefield communication, and it proved to be the decisive factor in their victory. The final offensive, which led to the capture of Berlin and the eventual collapse of the Third Reich, showcased the overwhelming power of the American military machine. Their tanks, equipped with state-of-the-art radios, were able to outmaneuver and outfight the Germans, despite being outnumbered in some instances. The Germans, on the other hand, were left to fight a losing battle with outdated and ineffective communication systems. Their command structure, once considered the epitome of military strategy, was now crumbling under the weight of technological inferiority. As the war in Europe came to a close, the Germans were forced to confront the reality that their failure to modernize their communication systems had sealed their fate. Despite having some of the best tanks and artillery in the world, they were unable to coordinate their forces effectively, and this weakness was exploited by the Allies. The Americans, with their superior radios and networked communication systems, had proven that modern warfare was not just about firepower, it was about information, dominance. The story of the American Sherman tank's radio superiority serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of communication in warfare. It wasn't just about having the most powerful weapons or the best trained soldiers. It was about the ability to work together as a cohesive unit, sharing information and coordinating movements. The SCR-508 radio, with its crystal-clear communication, revolutionized how wars were fought and demonstrated the power of technology in modern combat. Looking back, it's clear that the Germans failed to recognize the importance of battlefield communication until it was too late. They had focused all their efforts on developing superior tanks and weapons, but they had neglected the one aspect that could have made all the difference: communication. The Allies, on the other hand, understood that in the modern era, the side with the best communication systems would always have the advantage. They invested heavily in technology, that allowed them to stay connected and coordinate their movements, giving them a strategic edge that the Germans couldn't match. In the years that followed the war, the lessons learned from the Allied victory were applied to military strategies around the world. The concept of network-centric warfare, where information dominance is key to success, became the foundation of modern military doctrine. The story of the SCR-508 radio and the way it transformed the battlefield is a testament to the power of communication and the role it plays in shaping the outcome of wars. And the world moved into the post-war era. The significance of the Allies' technological edge became even more apparent. The rapid advancement of communication systems, fueled by innovations like the SCR-508, paved the way for modern military strategies and technologies. The lessons learned from World War II have continued to shape military tactics and strategies to this day, with communication technology playing a central role in the success of military operations worldwide. The American victory in World War II was not just a result of superior firepower or tactical brilliance, it was the result of a technological revolution that changed the way wars were fought. The SCR-508 radio and the communication systems it enabled were critical to the success of the Allied forces. It was this technological superiority that allowed the Allies to coordinate their efforts, outmaneuver the Germans, and ultimately win the war. In the end, it wasn't just the tanks, the guns, or the soldiers that won the war. It was the ability to communicate. The SCR-508 radio, which connected every tank, every unit, and every soldier on the battlefield, proved to be the game changer. The Germans, despite their superior tanks, were no match for the Allied forces, who were able to communicate and coordinate with precision and efficiency. The Allies' ability to stay connected across the battlefield, share information instantly, and respond to threats in real time was the key to their success. As the war drew to a close, the Germans were left to reflect on their failure to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. Their reliance on outdated communication systems had ultimately cost them the war. The Allies, on the other hand, emerged victorious, not just because of their superior weapons, but because of their ability to communicate and work together as a cohesive force. The victory of the Allies in World War II was a victory for technology, and the SCR-508 radio stands as a symbol of the power of communication in modern warfare.